Okay, welcome to our new unit, the Industrial Revolution, how we get where we are today. So before we talk about the unit, we need to talk about what the Industrial Revolution is so that we understand what we're going to be studying. The Industrial Revolution is the change that occurred between late early 1800s and continues to present day, where people used to make goods by hand at home to making everything we have in factories. Think about it. In our home, we have probably next to nothing that was not made in a factory. When we're talking about the Industrial Revolution, textile mills, textile industry will begin the Industrial Revolution. It will be a change in transportation, a change in production, a change in the economic system. So much will be going on. So let's start. Where does it begin? Well, it begins with something called the cottage industry. And the cottage industry was what was in place before the Industrial Revolution. You would have to have about probably about 90% of your people involved in working in the fields. But these people would also make cloth in their homes. Think about the spinning wheels that you see from colonial days. That's an example of the cottage industry where you would make cloth, you would make thread. The merchant would come around, buy it, but everything you were basically using was produced when you weren't farming, you were working in the home. That brings us to the next process in the industrialization, moving from that cottage industry to something called industrialization. And that's that process of making goods by hand to producing goods by machines. Kind of the urban game was kind of like showing us how that development of factories and this industrialization process will change society. For a society to industrialize, you're going to need natural resources. Natural resources are raw materials. All natural resources are raw materials, but not all raw materials are natural resources. So you're going to need, for example, oil and coal and water as your power sources. So when we're looking at natural resources, we're looking at anything that comes from nature that we can use to help us. Today we're using a lot of sun and solar and wind power as natural resources. In addition to natural resources, you need raw materials. Raw materials are products used to make other goods. So they can be natural resources, coal, oil, water, sun, etc. But they can also be cotton, tobacco. Even today, here's some examples of modern raw materials. Anything that we are using, putting into a product and changing into something else. So sorry about that. That moves to the means of production, sometimes called the factors of production. All factories, all goods and services need things to make it. So capital is the capital, the land, the factories and resources needed to make a product. When we're looking at the means of production, it's anything that goes in to the production of a good. For example, if you have shoes and you use leather, the actual material, the shoelace, the leather, the factory where it was built, the land, all of those are your means of production. So this thing I'm saying capital, what is capital? Capital is just money we use to invest in a business. When you purchase a stock, for example, if you buy stock in Apple, you're giving that company capital because you have to pay the workers. You have to build the factory. You have to buy the land for the factory. You have to buy the materials in. So that is capital, money that is invested in a business. Now, to industrialize to the point that we are today, you're going to have to be using something called interchangeable parts. They're machine-made parts that can be switched between products. Think about when you were a kid and you played with Legos. If you notice, the yellow Lego and the green Lego, they can be used to build that house. Think about when you have a car. You don't want to go buy, when your tire breaks, you don't have to buy a new car, you just replace the tire because the product is standardized. Also, part of the modern development is division of labor. So what we're doing is when we're industrializing and we're getting assembly lines and we have interchangeable parts, we want to make things faster. So we are going to use a concept called division of labor. So taking that task or job and dividing the work. I always think of division of labor with Chipotle. One of the reasons you can get food so quickly at Chipotle is you have people cooking in the background. You take your order, they move it down the line. The person who takes your order is not the same one who rings it up at the register. So another word that we're going to be using a lot in the industrialization is in the Industrial Revolution is labor. Labor is a common theme. You're probably familiar with it, but I just wanted to review it with you, work or workers. We're familiar. Mrs. Keating is a laborer in high school. It's anybody who, a worker. It's just another name for a worker. Labor, especially in the Industrial Revolution, is going to face harsh conditions. You're going to have child labor, you're going to have, 14-hour days, 14-hour days, 7 days a week, no breaks. It's going to be really poor working conditions. So workers are going to join together and form labor unions. And labor unions are, if Mrs. Keating goes on strike, well, big deal, that's one teacher. But if all the teachers in Chantilly High School quit working, then it's a little harder to replace them. So labor unions are these group of workers joining for better working conditions. And what they do when they get these better working conditions is they do another vocabulary word which is called collective bargaining. Collective bargaining is when you have employers meet with a group of workers, usually representatives from the union, to reach agreement for better working conditions. You guys are most familiar with collective bargaining when you hear the NFL, the NHL, or baseball talk about the collective bargaining agreement. It's that agreement that these people worked out. This is how we are going to work. These are the conditions. And both the workers and the employers have to follow the agreement. One of the movements that comes out of the Industrial Revolution is the suffrage movement, the right to vote. As people get industrialized, more people, working conditions, men get the right to vote. Eventually, women are going to want a right to vote, and they're going to push for the right to vote to help fix some of these working conditions. Now, we're going to talk about some of the economics of the Industrial Revolution. 3 terms that we will use to describe the economic systems that emerge as a result of the Industrial Revolution are capitalism, socialism, and communism. First one, capitalism, free market sometimes referred to. We're going to give you some basic working definitions. As we go into the unit, we'll get more of them. An economic system where consumers decide what's produced and there's private ownership of those means of production. Think about today with capitalism. Think about it in the terms of the government doesn't own McDonald's, the government doesn't own Chipotle, they are owned by stockholders. So this idea that you are producing, you are making goods without government interference. One problem that does develop during the Industrial Revolution is you're going to get a very big group of wealthy, a small group of wealthy and a large group of poor, and there's going to be a large income gap. And so what people want to do is, how do we fix this? Redistribution of wealth. The idea that taking some of the money from the rich and giving it to the poor. Think Robin Hood, just to get a basic understanding of redistribution of wealth. One of the things that also the economic system that tries to address some of the abuses of the Industrial Revolution is socialism. It is an economic, we're going to bridge it a little bit better, a little bit this way, and I'll explain more in class. An economic system where consumers decide what's produced, but government owns the means of production, trying to fix that income gap, fixing those problems that are occurring. One of the primary thinkers of socialism, one of the early thinkers, was Robert Owen. Communism is the big one this year, and communism is we're going to take it an economic system where the government owns the means of production and government decides what's produced. We're used to this with, Karl Marx founding it, Lenin, Stalin, Mao, Castro. We will talk more about it, but the idea that the government will control the economy and the government will control what is produced.